Hello, and welcome to another episode of the AgNext Podcast. We're always excited to tell you about what's next from AgNext. I'm Jen Reeskamp. Most folks call me JR. I'm the head of strategy here at AgNext, and I'm one of the co-hosts on the podcast along with
Pedro Carvalho. I'm an assistant professor here with AgNext as well.
So we're excited today to offer up another Listener's Choice episode. We'll be interviewing Dr. Sara Place about her recent publication, examining the role of ruminants in sustainable food systems. Thanks to everybody who participated in the poll, and let's get into it.
Welcome, Dr. Place. It's a pleasure to have you here again.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Almost a co-host now.
Yes, yes.
No, that's thank you everyone who voted for this research paper. So, Dr. Place, this is a paper that was recently published in the Journal of Grass and Forage Science, correct?
Yes.
And it sounds like it's an invited review, and it came out after you gave a presentation on the International Grasslands Conference, right?
Yes.
Can you just tell us a little bit how was the presentation and how the invitation came across and what it takes to get this published in the journal?
Yeah. So this was actually about a year ago. The International Grasslands Congress was held in outside of Cincinnati in Kentucky. Mm-hmm. And so my talk was one of several kind of plenary presentations on the role of ruminants and grasslands. And actually the presentation itself had a real strong focus on One Health. So that was kind of the theme of the Congress that year was about health and thinking about how healthy ruminants, healthy grasslands all fit together in a sustainable system. So as a part of that, like many kind of invited presentations, there was an opportunity from that society to submit a paper. And so that's what this paper is basically a companion piece to that presentation, and I went through the peer review process, and now it's available. So
now it's hot off the press.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So in terms of your decision to move forward with that, what was your inspiration to say, yeah, I will write this?
Yeah, I think it's a good way to always summarize a key topic area, right? And for this, it was, of course, there was that health aspect to it, but I think a broader systems perspective of how do ruminants fit within sustainable food systems. Mm-hmm. There are some papers out there on it, but in terms of hitting all the topics that I wanted to cover, I felt like that was a gap. So I wanted to write that paper and really try to summarize that in a succinct way, all those different topic areas of considering sustainability and how ruminants can fit within a sustainable food system.
Awesome.
That leads us to a question that I have, like what a sustainable food system looks like. What is that?
Yeah. So I think it's important to start with like, well, what's a food system, right? Because I think oftentimes we think about agriculture, we think about food. Food system is kind of that idea of pulling all those pieces together. So all the actors within a value chain to produce food, right? Mm-hmm. Everything from the actual agriculture part of it and the agriculturalists, the people that are involved, the farm workers, the actual landscapes, all that to, retail or to the actual people that are consuming that food, and all the complex systems that can happen post-harvest, if you will, with whatever food we're talking about, post-harvest, post-processing. So thinking about a sustainable food system, right, there's different definitions out there. There's ones from the UN, Food and Agriculture Organization, and really what they focus on is thinking about the three domains of sustainability, right, that we've talked about before, of thinking about they have to be socially responsible and socially viable, thinking about the community, thinking about can people afford food, the actors within the value chain, right, how are they being compensated or treated. We can think about the environmental sustainability component of it, and that's a lot of what I focused on in this review. And we can think about the economic viability and the financial viability, right? So obviously that's a key criteria for a sustainable food system, is we actually have to have the actors within that food system be able to sustain themselves, right? And people have to be able to afford food. So all those complex issues all fall within the idea of a sustainable food system. And there's obviously a large number of people that are involved in making that happen every day in the United States and around the world.
Which makes it's very challenging to define what is a sustainable food system, right?
Yes.
And what are the main things that you take in consideration? Why do you have to take in consideration the framework? And And you give, I think, like 3 really nice different perspectives on defining sustainable food system in this publication.
Yeah. So there's many ways we can think about sustainable, and so I've kind of pulled off one of them in that paper, or pulled out one of the frameworks of thinking about sustainability, or thinking about even food systems themselves, and what is most important, right? So this is kind of building off some work that came out of the 1980s and has been summarized by a few others. But really what it's focused on is thinking about different priorities that people have and different value judgments people bring to this conversation. Because that's also what's important about sustainable food systems. It's not just pure objective, emotionalist science that we're talking about, but rather there's value judgments that are infused in there too. So that framework, there's 3 ways to think about it, right? The first is kind of what we could say is like pro-productionist, or focused on productivity and food security, right? And oftentimes, to be self-reflective about it, right? That's where a lot of folks in like animal science, or a lot of folks at land-grant universities fall into that bucket, right? Where it's like the primary goal of the food system, and thinking about this, is to make sure that we produce adequate nutrition for people. And if there's sometimes a trade-off or sacrifice for that, that's okay, because we have to be able to nourish everybody, right? And so it's like that we need to produce more, we got to feed a growing world population. Those kind of statements fall under that umbrella. The second one is really prioritizing environment first, or environmental stewardship, and the resource bases that we have to produce that food, right? So it's not that these things are in conflict, but there may be a case where, if we're degrading an underlying soil resource or water resource in the service of this pro-productionist view, right, that second school of thought of people that subscribe to that primarily may be saying, look, this is not sustainable, right? Yes. If we're degrading our underlying resources to feed ourselves, that's in the long run not going to work, right? So that's kind of that prioritizing of environmental stewardship, or an ecological focus. And then the third one is kind of more amorphous or larger, this idea that, look, the food system or agriculture fits within society, right? And so we have to think about all the interplays of other support systems that agriculture relies on, whether it's roads or the community, and agriculturalists are a part of the community. So we have to take this bigger holistic view as our primary focus. And none of those are like necessarily mutually exclusive, but they're just different priorities that people bring to the discussion. And that sometimes when you're talking about sustainability with folks is important to keep in mind, is people may be kind of more leaning towards different frameworks of how they describe the problem. And then that's always where we come into like, well, why can't we agree on this? But it's because people have
You're working from different places to begin with.
Different frameworks of how you're viewing the problem. Yeah.
That's pretty cool. Like you gave like those 3 frameworks. Like I even wrote like 3 S frameworks, like security, stewardship, and society.
Yes.
Oh, interesting. I like that summary.
Yes.
That's
and
nice.
It's not that one excludes the other, but they can. It's hard. Like I've had different views, even myself, how I was shown, how I was educated in some views, and okay, let's do this, let's do that. But it was pretty cool to see, and to me at least, to understand those different frameworks. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's important to, and that's kind of trying to be a theme of the paper, right? To be self-reflective and critical of like, well, where are these critiques of, say, ruminant systems coming from, right? And we should engage with those directly and really think about, there's always some nuggets of truth in some of these critiques. And so how do you address some of these concerns around sustainability regarding animal ag and specifically ruminant agriculture?
Yeah, I think that's a really good segue kind of into our next question of what we were hoping to talk more about was, what is the specific role that domesticated ruminants play in a sustainable food system? And kind of that, in the paper, you did a really nice job of breaking it down into kind of addressing some of the either key issues or key opportunities that are available when we discuss this grand challenge that you talk about. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But a lot of times we talk about greenhouse gas emissions from domesticated ruminants, and they're often criticized and critiqued. Why is that? And what do you offer in the paper that is counter to that argument?
Yeah, and it's important to just start with the reality of, like, of course, ruminant agriculture produces greenhouse gas emissions. That's true. And if we think about it from a global perspective, there are more greenhouse gas emissions coming from ruminant agriculture as compared to non-ruminant animal ag, which would be poultry and swine production, right? That's also true. And the big part of that is the enteric methane that these animals produce, which we've talked about before, right? And thinking about that biological reality. So that is a key concern, and that's something that does have to be addressed. Also, ruminants are not the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States or in the world, but that methane piece is a key component and part of the challenge of how do we reduce those emissions. And so one of those things to consider is just like the trends over time of methane emissions, and that's some of the complexity of this is this is where we get back to those different frameworks, right? Places in the world where actually ruminant agriculture is growing are more of the developing countries in the world. So if we actually look at the data, right, where are we kind of stable or declining with our ruminant populations? And that would be more of like North America, Western Europe, New Zealand, Australia, those places that are large exporters and historically large producers of ruminant products tend to have pretty stable or even declining ruminant populations in many of those countries. That's important when we think about greenhouse gas emissions because, of course, the number of animals is a key driver in how much greenhouse gas emissions come out of those sectors, right? At the same time, parts of the developing world are growing in their population of ruminants, but so aren't their human populations and their nutritional demands. So it becomes real sticky in terms of we need to mitigate emissions, but this is where you start bleeding into those other components of sustainability, right?
Yeah.
To address emissions, we don't want to necessarily reduce the nutritional output of the industry in a big way, particularly in those places where we need that high quality nutrition, right? So it's a real tricky situation.
A lot of trade-offs in that conversation, it sounds like.
Yes, absolutely.
And understanding that it's pretty important. And one of the challenges, the feed food competition, when we have those trade-offs conversation, right, in the land use, and you address that in a very nice way, like explaining what is the value of the rangeland and the grasslands, and how it competes with human feed. We hear that a lot. Can you just expand a little bit on that as well?
Yeah. So we can think about feed food competition as always a central issue in a lot of these sustainability conversations for decades, right? Yeah. And part of that is direct competition. So truly, are the animals eating things that could be consumed by humans? And then the other part of it is the land base, right? So maybe they're not eating things that could be consumed by humans, but could we be putting that land to quote unquote better use? And this is really important for ruminants because just like with greenhouse gas emissions, there's no denying that ruminant agriculture takes more quote unquote land use compared to other forms of agriculture. But that is that central trade-off of most of those land bases are not necessarily land bases that can be used for other production.
Not really suitable for any other kind of crop or anything like that. And
part of the discussion in the paper is that question of what does suitability mean? Because there's a whole world of assumptions built into that word, right? So
yes, that's true.
There's some nice work by the UN Food and Agriculture Organization over the last several years where they've looked at feed food competition at a global level and land suitability. What's interesting is if you dig into that publication, one of those publications is like all the Great Plains of the United States is viewed as, of course, land that's suitable for row crop production. But as we know from a conservation standpoint, we're trying to preserve actually a lot of our grasslands, and especially like the northern Great Plains and up into Canada because of the ecological benefits of that grassland. So that becomes one of those challenges of like, theoretically it's suitable. We could just plow it all up and we could grow other crops on it. Do we want to? Back to that second school of thought.
Unintended consequence,
right? There might be water quality. There might be, we lose soil carbon for sure when we plow ground like that. So it's
even like
tricky.
bird populations, like a number of animal habitats and that sort of thing that would be traded off. You can sort of automatically,
exactly. Right? You can think about those grasslands almost as like the function of a kidney, right, for our whole water system in the U.S. Right? I mean, they help purify water, right? And so getting rid of those permanent grasslands has some negative implications. So central issue of feed food competition is how do you define suitability, right, in that piece? And that's where to be clear with what some of the arguments are is that we could get rid of ruminants, right, or dramatically reduce their population, and then we could allow certain landscapes to quote unquote rewild, right? Or places where theoretically there were trees before they could grow trees, or whatever it may be, and that would sequester so much carbon it would be a benefit in aggregate, right? And those arguments are also challenging because you have to think about the social implications of all of those steps, right? All those dominoes that would theoretically have to fall, right? From, well, who owns the land, and then who decides this, and how is that landscape going to be managed? Because we know just unmanaged landscapes also create risks, as with the Western U.S. and some of our wildfire issues, right? So it's really
it's complex.
Very complex.
It's
sometimes
complex.
Surface level on peer-reviewed papers, it seems very easy, right? Like, well, this is a no-brainer. Why don't we just get rid of these ruminants? But it can be more complex on the ground.
And I think that's one of the beauty of the ruminants, right? Is the ability to convert that grass to a high quality protein and food to humans, right? So I think getting away with those animals, like it might create some food insecurity, like you were talking earlier on.
And that's really important too, is just, especially globally, this is that central trade-off as well. It's like most of those countries that have higher greenhouse gas emissions per pound of ruminant meat or ruminant milk also tend to use very little human edible feed inputs, right? So there's a central trade-off there where their return and their ability to contribute positively to the food supply is almost infinite when they have no human edible feeds going into that system. Yes, their greenhouse gas emissions may be higher, but if we think about pastoral systems around the world, they've obviously been sustainable because they've been around for thousands of years, right?
Sure.
And those systems can continue with the management considerations of the resource base. So that's a key part of that challenge as well, is we can increase productivity by putting in more human edible inputs into ruminants, which we have to think about to feed more people. But at the same time, we start eating into the benefit of ruminants in terms of using more of those feedstuffs that are in competition with human food. So
we touched on this a little bit, but I'm hoping we can kind of dive a little bit deeper into human nutrition and how ruminants can support growing population of people in the U.S., but also globally, although you did say it was kind of declining. Or no, you said ruminants were declining. I'll let you clarify that whenever you start talking. But just curious about if we can talk a little bit about nutritional security and the role that ruminants play there.
Yeah. So whether it's meat or milk, right, of course, that's one of the unique things about just animal source foods more broadly, and particularly ruminant products, is they tend to have obviously high quality protein in terms of amino acids and digestibility, but also a lot of micronutrients that we sometimes don't talk as much about, whether it's like vitamin B12 or zinc. Some of the fatty acids that we now know are probably more essential for us to consume in human nutrition, right? So those are also really key aspects of ruminant agriculture's contribution to the food system, is they produce a lot of nutrient-dense food, not as many calories, which is logical, right? Of course. In aggregate around the world, we all, vast majority, get most of our calories, our energy from plants. But certain parts of the world, right, the nutrient density of those foods is really, really important, ruminant products, in terms of delivering those essential micronutrients. And we see some of those interplays, and there's different efforts out there to try to increase the supply of those micronutrients via increasing access and availability to ruminant products, because they can make a big difference, especially in vulnerable populations, whether it's young children, pregnant women. Those are especially populations where those products are important. And if we think about the macro trends, right, so because we have declining ruminant populations, you would think the total amount of, say, beef in the U.S. has gone down, but it's actually gone up, right? But what's an interesting wrinkle is, right, we actually eat less beef per person in the United States compared to the 1970s, right? So because population keeps growing faster than ruminant meat production, basically that's true even around the world, right? Like the amount of ruminant meat available per person has not really seriously increased. So that's one of those things as well, is just recognizing probably the world is not going to eat a majority ruminant
Yes.
products, right?
Yeah,
it's
sure.
going to be a base, and it's going to be important as a contribution in that whole omnivorous food system that we have. But that's always one of those reality checks that's important as well. Is right, we're not eating an increasing amount of beef per person in the world, or ruminant meat in general in the world, right? It's actually flat to declining. Milk has slightly increased, but that's just one of those reality checks as well, as monogastrics also play an important role, and they've actually increased in terms of the total supply per person in the world.
That's pretty interesting, because sometimes we just think about the animal production increasing, but we forget about the human population. It's also increasing a lot.
Increasing even more, right? So that's the part that the percent change per year, right? Those different annual rates we have to think about as well, and that population is over indexed our growth in ruminant meat production specifically.
No, that's pretty cool. Sarah, one of the things that you mentioned early on is that, like, you presented this in a conference that had One Health as a main theme of the conference, right? And you touched that a little bit in the paper, consider like animal health and welfare. Can you just tell our listeners, like, what is your perspective, and what did you describe a little bit on this One Health view of, like, health people, health animals, health ecosystems?
Yeah.
And what do you talk a little bit here in this publication?
Yeah. So One Health could be thought of as like basically interwoven with this whole concept of sustainability, because it is also that multi-pronged perspective. So just like you just said, Pedro, it is this idea that animal health, human health, ecological health are all tied together, right? With current events, right, there's obviously zoonotic diseases where that's very apparent, right, where we have wild animal populations affecting domestic and human animal health, right? And there's examples of, say, like tuberculosis or other diseases where that can definitely happen. A key part of that is when we have domesticated ruminants that are healthy, they tend to be more productive, right? We tend to have fewer losses of those animals, and that can make a big difference in terms of the environmental footprint, total land requirements, total feed resource requirements for that ruminant system. So that's really where animal health is a key part of actually improving the productivity of the system. And that's one of those nice win-wins, is oftentimes when animals have better health or even a better state of welfare, right, they tend to be more productive, and we tend to lower environmental impacts. And that's one of the more recent UNFAO publications looking at the sustainability and the path forward for sustainability of animal agriculture around the world. I think they estimated that there's an opportunity to reduce the global footprint of animal ag by about 10% by just improving animal health in the next few decades.
That was pretty amazing to me to read that, and I mean it's a great challenge, but also as we have challenges, there's also huge opportunity.
Yes,
just improving the things that probably know how to do it. We're not always doing, and improving animal health. It's one of those.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
absolutely. Yeah.
So we've already talked about this a little bit, but I want to just give you a chance to elaborate a little bit more on it too. Tell us why it's important to have ruminants to maintain a sustainable food system. So right now, our global food system is built with the inclusion of domesticated ruminants. And so what would it look like to see a major shift? Would we actually see some of those benefits that are described if that were to happen? Anyway, just wanted to get your perspective on that.
Yeah. So I think it's always one way to think about it is almost like a value proposition of like, why did we domesticate these animals in the first place, right? And I think that's always kind of a truth check, if you will, of like, if these animals are so inefficient and so costly, then why the heck did we domesticate them in the first place?
Why have we been hanging out with them for a long time?
Yeah, exactly. For thousands of years. This is kind of weird.
Besides that they're cute.
Yeah.
And the funny, we're just talking about the food that those animals provide, right?
Yes.
There are many other things.
If we think about the bigger system, right, and that's where I'd say the ruminant shines, right? So it's not just that they are provisioning food, but they're also provisioning fiber. They're also provisioning fuel in many parts of the world, right? They're provisioning draft power, right? And we can think about many examples where they're provisioning pharmaceuticals or other products within
medical advancements.
There's people that have heart valves that are all dependent upon cattle, right?
My dad is one of those.
That's right. So your dad is alive because of a bovine, right?
Yeah,
so that's a huge contribution of these animals to not just the food system, but society, right? So I think the bigger picture there is thinking about these animals are taking human inedible solar energy locked up in plants on landscapes we do not have access to without them. And they allow us to access that energy, right, in the form of breaking down cellulose with the microbial populations they have in their rumen. And that unlocks that and inserts it into our food system that would otherwise not be there. Right. So that's a huge advantage of these animals. And I think that's kind of the primary thing of thinking about. It allows us to produce food on these landscapes while also having all these other ecosystem services or benefits we get from nature, right? Back to the water filtration, the wildlife habitat, all those things can be simultaneous. It doesn't have to be either or. It can be the same thing on the same land base, that multifunctional use. So our goal is really how do we enhance those positives? And then when we think about this other word I know you could use is the circularity, right? The idea of we consume plants, the animal consumes it, they produce manure, it can go back to the land, right? That circularity component. In that circular system, there are nutrient losses, right? Nothing is 100% efficient, and so sometimes nitrogen or other things can be lost to the environment. So our challenge is how do we make sure that we minimize that loss, right? Minimize our issues of where we concentrate a bunch of nutrients and we don't export them back out of the system. Those type of issues is really our central challenge, I would say. And so thinking about ruminants in a food system, that's really their central value, right? That symbiotic relationship they have with those microorganisms and all the other benefits they provide to the food system. And if we were to pluck them out of the food system, we'd have to think about alternatives for all those things, including your dad's heart, right? So those are a lot of gaps we would have to fill if we got rid of them completely. Yeah.
And I think we are not even touching the lifestyle that plays a huge role in many cultures here. In the
That's actually, that's a great point, Pedro, right? Culturally, incredibly important, right? There's estimates of over 1 billion people kind of depend upon livestock in general, right, around the world, and especially a lot of people that have lower incomes, right? And in culture, I mean, I've seen a historian kind of give a talk on this of just thinking about the centrality of cattle in our culture. I mean, everything from Red Bull, right, branded products. You don't think about how many places that cattle show up in our culture, our language. And it's it is even in a modern society, right? We are still tied to a lot of those cultural cues from ruminants.
That's interesting.
That's pretty cool. And lead us to one of our next questions, how do value judgments and science come together here or not? It's a very...
It's tricky, right? And particularly when we talk about, I always just say that in presentations, right? When we use those should questions, should we be raising this many ruminants? Should we be eating beef or other ruminant products, right? When we use those words should, it does infuse all those value judgments into the conversation, right? And back to those different frameworks, right? If people have different views, right? If their primary focus is, I just view it as, unacceptable to use animals in any way, shape, or form in society, right? Clearly, somebody who subscribes to that view may have a very different view to this conversation that we're having right now and say that's all well and good, but it's just morally wrong, right? Or my values say that's morally wrong, so therefore we should not do that, right? And I think you have to respect those different viewpoints, right? Because there's 8 billion people on planet Earth. It would be very strange if we all agreed, right, on anything. Right? So I think the key thing is just being transparent about what those values are when you come to these discussions. And I wish we did that more of just laying that out, right? And particularly us, again, to be self-critical in animal science or in a lot of land-grant universities of being look, we're mostly pro-productionist, right? We mostly view it as if there's some sort of sacrifice to any potential food security, we all kind of recoil from that immediately, right? And so that's just knowing and recognizing that in ourselves of We're not perfectly objective as scientists by any way, shape, or form. We're all human beings, right? So that part is important too, is just being self-reflective, thinking about that of why do I think that? Do I think that purely because of the evidence, or do I think that because of the value judgments that I bring to this discussion as well?
So can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
So as a scientist, how do you do your best to remain objective when you're working in these really complicated, really complex, framework-based issues?
I think the key thing is that self-reflection, right? And knowing when, if you have a reaction to something or you view something and you want to have that counter argument immediately, is to know where is that coming from, right?
There's something here. I should pay attention to that.
Yes. And
being open to different opinions.
Being open to different opinions. And I think a key thing is, for me, I like to read the literature that is critical of animal agriculture, right? Sometimes papers that cite me in a non-flattering way. But I think that's important.
You're probably doing something right then, I guess.
Yeah. But I think that's important to read those and to digest those critiques and think about, okay, how do we incorporate that into thinking about this system, right? Because ultimately what you're trying to do in this conversation is take those places where there are trade-offs, and can you ever turn them into synergies, or do they always remain trade-offs? What could we do differently that could change those paradigms?
And to me, one of the very nice things that I came across, like, while reading this, was those frameworks. Like, I mean, understanding there are different ways that people are educated or trained or raised, or and okay, why is this person thinking on that way, and why is this person just think about productivity? Why is this one just think about like and understanding the framework where they were raised? And I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, I think we've had a really robust conversation. I'm curious to talk a little bit more about the end of the paper. In the conclusion, you described a grand challenge that we all face. And so I really appreciated in that you said our. And so I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about our, and then also what is that grand challenge?
Yeah. So I think the our part of it is we are all collectively here on planet Earth.
Yes.
So these sustainability conversations.
You want or not.
Yeah. We are flying through space on this rock together. So
there you go.
Yes. So any of these sustainability challenges, whether it's climate change or thinking about the quality of water, do people have access to water? Do they have drinking water? How does ruminant agriculture influence with all those issues, right? That's where the R comes from, because it is collectively our challenge to figure out how we create a more sustainable food system and nourish ourselves. And that's our central challenge, is how do we feed ourselves, nourish ourselves? And I keep saying nourish, meaning not just simply, do you have enough calories, but back to, do you have enough essential nutrients? Do you have culturally relevant food?
Nutrient density and kind
nutrient
of conversations.
Density, yeah, those type of things. So how do we put that in perspective with the fact that we do have one planet Earth, and at least for the next several decades, we still have a growing world population. So we have pressure points on ourselves right now. And so a big part of it is, how do you address a lot of these sustainability concerns and increase productivity? Because here's my bias coming out, right? It's like, well, because we have a growing world population, we can't just ignore that first school of thought, right? Like food security is actually very central until we stop growing our population in the world. So we have to check all those boxes at once. And again, take it from a standpoint of, how do we turn trade-offs into synergies? And I think a big part of that is doing research that decouples some of these challenges. So one example would be, okay, if growing numbers of ruminants create challenges, how do we increase productivity so we don't grow as many ruminants, right, globally, the population, more stabilize it? And then what do we have in terms of technologies that can lower emissions per animal or absolute emissions and still maintain or improve productivity? Right? So we need those kind of solutions that flip things on its head and say, instead of just this very crude view that just all that matters is the number of animals, how do we flip that around and say, we need to increase productivity, total amount of production, do so in environmentally responsible, socially responsible ways to the animal, to its health, to communities, but then also lower emissions, lower impacts. And so that's a big challenge, right? That is our challenge. And that's where research, development, extending knowledge, right? Hearing from people on the ground of like what they need.
The AgNext mission,
the AgNext mission, the land-grant university mission. That's where that comes into play. Of like, we need to get busy on that here in the U.S., around the world, because it is our collective challenge.
Well, I think that was a great summary. Dr. Place, where can folks find a copy of this open access journal?
Yeah, so one, it's available on the AgNext website, so there's a link to it there. Yep. And then it is on Grass and Forage Science, so that journal from Wiley is where it can be found, open access.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And so thank you again for joining us for an episode of the AgNext podcast. We're always excited to tell you about what's next from AgNext. Be sure to follow us on social media, either Facebook, X, or LinkedIn, and keep an eye out for future opportunities so that you can vote on what we're going to chat about on our podcast. And if you have any, as always, if you have any comments, suggestions, or feedback, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at agnext.colostate.edu, and we'll get back to you as quick as we can. Thanks again.